Welcome to Magic the Flavouring, the Magic the Gathering podcast, where we talk about all things Magic, flavor design, and lore. I'm your host, Andy Mann, and today I'm going to be talking about Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate. You'll have noticed I've not really been around as of late. In fact, I took a little bit of a break last month. The last episode I did was the solo Scryfalling, and I haven't put out an episode since then. And honestly, for those of you that were maybe wondering where we've gone, we haven't stopped the podcast, but I needed to take just a couple of beats. It wasn't necessarily intentional. There's just been a lot of life stuff going on, and sometimes you just have to kind of take your foot off the gas of one thing to kind of focus on another. So there we go. Life is hard sometimes, right? How are you? Are you okay? I didn't ask that at the top of the show. I should have done. I'm getting through. But there is magic to be spoken about. So let's talk about some magic. Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate is upon us, and it's pretty exciting, I think. Long-time listeners of the show will know that my feelings about Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering as this kind of combined product now, because we had the Adventures of the Forgotten Realms, obviously, as a draft format, and then we had several Commander decks, and now we've got this is our second Commander Legends set. People know that I've been sort of lukewarm on it, and I love D&D, obviously love Magic as well, and I'm absolutely thrilled that these sets exist for the people that want these sets to exist. But in general, I've just sort of thought, maybe they're not for me. There's a lot of references, there's a lot of lore going on that if you're someone like me, obviously, who does a bloody Vorthos podcast, where these things matter and they do inform how you engage with each set, to not really know enough about the lore and to also really not be in a position where you can take on like a whole other world as well to kind of, pack your head in. This is a lot, right? And there are quite a lot of things, and I think this is to both Adventures in the Forgotten Realms and Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate. There are a lot of things that are good about the fact that you can tell if I was to pick up, or any Magic fan was to pick up a D&D Magic card and a card from a mainline Magic set and hold them up side by side, you'd probably guess which one was from D&D or D&D inspired, just because of the tone, maybe the creature types that are on it, even maybe slightly, potentially, the artwork that's used, because although both games use the same artists, and I'm not suggesting that, they chose a wildly different art style for these Magic cards, there's just certain things about maybe like the tone, the colour palette of like these worlds that's going on that might lead you to kind of go, that to me says D&D more than Magic the Gathering. So I just kind of feel like, for me, they haven't grabbed me quite as much. But I must say, and I've had disputes with people on social medias about this, not disputes, disagreements, conversations. I actually think Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate, I'm just going to call it Baldur's Gate from now on, is grabbing me more flavourfully than Adventures in Forgotten Realms AFR ever did. And I think if you remember our flavour picks from AFR, Nathan and I really tried to keep up with like the individual bits of lore, but really we kind of approached it as we would any other of our flavour picks episodes, where we look at the broad strokes of how the set makes us feel and how the card functions happen. And I really dug the idea that AFR made you feel like you played Dungeons & Dragons in a Magic the Gathering format. Like, it was as close to the idea of looking at D&D through a Magic lens as you could get. And they do stuff like that in this set as well, but I think what they've done here cleverly is that they've given us aspects of that. They've given us things like the dice roll mechanics and the flavor-led ability text names and all that kind of stuff. But because it's specifically for the Commander format, they've obviously had to really think about what makes the format what it is, and therefore a lot of the stuff that's going on is more Magic-based, but with lots of D&D references. And they've also brought back a whole plethora of other abilities and mechanics and keywords and whatnot from across Magic's history to make these cards feel like they are Magic cards first, with the flavour of D&D on them. Whereas I think with AFR, because it was obviously the first time they did it, this just from my perspective, it felt like it was a D&D set with Magic cardboard kind of propping it up. And that's not to do it a disservice. I think they did a fantastic job. It just wasn't quite for me. I actually don't know how many AFR cards I even use in my decks. I don't think I use many, honestly. And I think I'll be using far more cards out of Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate. I've just whole named it again. Baldur's Gate. I'm going to say this at the top of the show. This is so the title of the episode. I haven't actually decided upon it. I decide these things after I record them. But the premise of this episode is going to be that I'm going to look at the flavour that's in Baldur's Gate and see what things that I think have been led by a D&D flavour and lore perspective, but is obviously being represented in Magic cards. Can Magic the Gathering, as its own IP, even though they are both run by Wizards of the Coast, what can Magic learn, take, adapt from D&D, furthermore integrated into the mainline Magic sets? Because it's all very well being like, oh, this is Baldur's Gate, this is the second D&D set. There are things here that we will love and blah, 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 but we're just going to leave it in D&D world. Because Magic's not perfect, and I think the world of Magic the Gathering, the kind of flavour and lore of Magic the Gathering, has maybe got some holes in it, which I don't see any reason personally can't be filled with the lessons of Dungeons & Dragons. And now that we have these themes from D&D represented on cardboard for a whole second set now, like it's part of Magic now, there's no getting away from it. I think there's things that can be learned, can be adapted, put into Magic proper, I say proper, like mainline sets, and rather than trying to turn Magic into Dungeons & Dragons, get bolstered by it. Was it like a rising tide lifts all ships? That's it, right? Sure. Okay. So yeah, I've had a look at all the different themes that I can see across Baldur's Gate. A lot of my thoughts and opinions on what Magic can learn from D&D in general are things to do with creature typings and variations in creature typings, so there's going to be a lot of that. There was one card that kind of spawned this whole episode idea for me, and I'm going to save it till last. If people keep up with our social media, our Twitter account especially, you probably already know which card it is, because I'm incredibly excited about it. And it's made me excited about RPGs as well, which, like, I've played Dungeons & Dragons, I've done a few campaigns, I know roughly the world of what's going on in the rules, I've listened to a few Dungeons & Dragons podcasts and, like, Let's Plays and all this kind of thing. I'm not unknown, but I'm definitely a novice. But there was one card that made me super excited, because it actually opened a big door in the world of D&D that I didn't know really existed, and definitely doesn't exist in Magic, and I think this needs to happen. So we'll get to that. But yeah, this will be our kind of flavor picks episode, I guess. I don't know, I'm kind of shaking up format things. We've done a few interview episodes, we've done a couple of solo episodes with me. Nathan will be back in the country in like a month's time, so he'll probably be back on the show sooner than we think, maybe. But yeah, we're shaking things up. I'm not doing a traditional Flavor Picks episode. This will be essentially our Flavor Picks episode. To be honest, this will probably be the only time I talk about Baldur's Gate or Dungeons & Dragons as a set. I did toy with the idea of getting like a friend of the podcast come on and talk about D&D in more depth and kind of run me through all the different references. Like, for example, Zuby from Magic with Zuby and Magic for Normies. Massive D&D nerd, but I just kind of feel like it doesn't matter as much to me. I know that's wild. I know that's so silly to say, but I don't think the individual references matter as much to me. What matters to me is the broad strokes of how the cards make me feel. So that's what I'm going to talk about in relation to Magic the Gathering, because that's what I care about. Okay, have I made that clear? Cool. I will apologise to all of the Dungeons & Dragons fans and people who are really up on the Dungeons & Dragons lore, who listen to this podcast as well. I discovered very quickly, whilst trying to sort of touch base on all the little comparisons I'm going to make, I did dip my toes into some of the D&D lore a little bit, like, proper. And one big overarching, I never remember which is correct for me as an Englishman, sort of themes I guess I've learned is that whilst I do think there's stuff that D&D can teach Magic in terms of the scope of its narrative and the way that it treats certain ideas of its lore, I will say Magic does a very good job of less is more, because whilst we have waxed lyrical, for example, about how, especially Dominarian era history of Magic the Gathering is vast and like dense and unknowable to some degrees, D&D takes it to a whole other level of like, oh well, this is true in terms of the lore, but also if that's not true, then there's this whole other thing. Good example is that I was looking at cosmologies. There's like 3 different agreed upon cosmologies and like makeup of how all the different planes of existence in D&D, or at least in the Forgotten Realms, kind of interact with each other. So pick one, I guess, because obviously the whole thing is that it's an RPG that you can have expansive storytelling, and over the sort of like 50 years that, you know, D&D has been a property, obviously these things get added to and tweaked over time and let go, and different editions come in and kind of retcon certain things, bits and bobs, and blah, 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 blah. Whereas Magic is a much more linear game in terms of, yes, there are things that have been retconned or added to or changed or expanded upon or let go, but the scope of it is kind of kept a lot tighter, or at least a lot more simply, so that things can be kind of modulated in and out without much kind of, you know, drastic overhaul. So I will say that I think Magic does an excellent job of keeping things just simple enough that you don't need to worry about certain things being changed or messed about with. But with all that being said, we're now at like the 10-minute mark, and I haven't even really started the episode, and it's just me talking. Okay, cool. I'm going to dive into it. So, what can D&D Magic cards teach Magic cards? I'm going to start with multifunctional equipment. Specifically, there are 3 cards in Baldur's Gate. You have Ghost Lantern, Horn of Valhalla, and Two-Handed Axe. And these are 3 equipments that Ghost Lantern's black, Horn of Valhalla is white, Two-Handed Axe is red, that all have the adventure mechanic. Adventure's back. Perfect. Exactly the kind of mechanic we would want to see in a D&D inspired set. The adventure mechanic, for those of you that didn't maybe play Eldraine, which probably unlikely as it's new enough that I think newer players would at least be aware of it, especially if you play standard at all. It's only just rotated at standard, is the idea that a permanent can have a instant or sorcery speed spell stapled onto it, so you're kind of changing the mode of what it's doing, but still flavorfully in keeping of what that thing is. So, for example, of Ghost Lantern is 1 black, a single black. I do that every time. For an artifact equipment, and it has whenever a creature you control dies, put a 1/1 counter on equipped creature. Equip 1. But its adventure is Bind Spirit. 1 and a black, 1 and a black for an instant adventure. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it really gives this ghost lantern, this lamp that contains a spirit, it gives it a use. I like to think of it a use when you have it in your possession, and a use for when you're actively using it, right? So the Bind Spirit is you using that item. Return target creature from your graveyard to your hand. So it's a reanimation thing. It's like you're capturing that spirit, right? And then whenever a creature you control dies, put a 1/1 counter on a creature. It shows that when something dies, when you have this lantern in your possession, you are going to grow more powerful. Horn of Valhalla, the static ability, it's 1 and a white. The kind of, equipped ability is equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control, equip 3, and its sorcery speed adventure is Ysgard's Call. Oh, do you know what? I played a lot of Skyrim. I should be better with that YS sound. Ysgard's Call, I think. Create X/1/1 white soldier creature tokens. So you're using the horn to blast and call people to arms. Or, if you have the horn, you have a position of authority. So people know that you are the kind of, the person who's rallying around. Two-Handed Axe is 2 and a red for an artifact equipment. Sweeping Cleave, 1 and a red is its instant adventure. Target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. And the sort of equipped ability is whenever a equipped creature attacks, double its power till end of turn. So it has this kind of similar effect on both sides, but with kind of slightly different sort of takes in it. Also, like the idea that a two-handed axe, and it is represented in the artwork by Milovaj Saran as being a double-sided, like a double-headed axe, has very similar ability on either side of the card, like as it's formatted. I don't know, that's kind of nice to me. Anyway, the reason I like these, and the reason I think they should be integrated more into Magic, because these are the only 3 equipments in the entire game that have this kind of modal adventure mechanic stapled onto them, and indeed has a kind of more standardized formatted way of having like multiple uses or multiple modes that you can kind of get out of them, is that in the flavor of holding an item, holding a piece of equipment, you should be able to have your character, if you're talking in sort of like D&D terms, or the creature that it's equipped to, or like you as a Planeswalker player playing these cards, you should have a bit more autonomy over this physical object, right? So if I was to have a sword or a dagger equipment, I could choose to equip that thing to my creature, so it gets like +1/+0 and death touch, let's say. Or I can choose to throw the dagger, because that's the kind of intuitive thing that you should be able to do with a piece of equipment. Now, obviously, when equipments are introduced to Magic, the idea was more that you were giving the creature the effect that the equipment had. For example, Basilisk Collar, which makes a return in this set indeed, gives a creature Death Touch and Lifelink. Does Death Touch? Ooh, it's definitely got Lifelink, hasn't it? Basilisk Collar. Yeah, that was right. Death Touch and Lifelink. So, that's the idea, that you're putting this item onto your creature and it's giving those abilities. But in my mind, when I first learned how to play Magic, there was definitely certain card types which I used to confuse and conflate all the time. Classic one, I'm sure most Magic players will attest to this when they first learned the game, was the difference between an instant and a sorcery, or at least to my tiny pea brain. That was something I really had to struggle with when I still struggle with it now. I constantly play, sorceries as if they're instants. But the idea that these two things are effectively leaving my hand in the same fashion, and they're not permanent, but they have different speed requirements. Enchantments and equipments, in my head, had always seemed way too close to each other to necessarily be, or at least auras, for example, to be two different card types. If you have an aura and an equipment that are attached to a creature, they're essentially interchangeable. Now, obviously, one's an artifact, one's an enchantment, and that has different sort of push and pulls in the game. But functionally, they're incredibly similar. So to give equipments this kind of slightly different spin, this modal thing, maybe slightly easier to remove because it's an artifact, costs a little bit more because you have to equip something, I think that's perfect, and they should integrate that way more. And you can see a lot of these things that I'm kind of picking up on now. They've either tried versions of it, or you can tell that there's like a little itch that the design team, or the world-building team, depending on where these kind of things lean more in terms of what I'm talking about, there are these little itches that they really want to scratch, and they really want to get out there. And I think we're starting to see it now. Like you saw in the last Commander Legends product, you had Togo, Goblin Weaponsmith, where his whole function was that he made rock artifact tokens they used to tap and then deal damage. To have the idea that these artifacts were somehow being used in a way that was more visceral by the creature, and I think that's a really cool idea. Obviously, the adventure mechanics aren't the creature using it per se, it's you as the player, but you get the idea. I love them. I really want them to continue into Magic proper, and I think it would give, if not maybe the adventure mechanic, like modal equipment would be just, it'd be amazing. I'd love to see it. Maybe much like MDFCs, it might be too much going on one bit of cardboard, but hey, Pandora's box is now open, unfortunately, on that regard. Okay. That was equipments. Next up, this is moving more into the creature types realm. I'm going to talk about fun with creature typings. I'm going to use a card as a kind of case study for this. The card I'm using the case study for this is Lulu, Loyal Hollyphant. Lulu, Loyal Hollyphant, is an Elephant Angel legendary creature for 3 under white. It has flying, and at the beginning of your end step, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, put a 1/1 counter on each tapped creature you control, then untap them. Choose a background, 3/2. The text box doesn't matter. What I'm interested in is the creature typings itself. Elephant Angel. This is, even though it's like a draft innovation set, this isn't an unset. This is a mainline Magic set, or at least it's, mainline in terms of it's not like a jokey set. And this, along with so many other cards in this this set here, really plays with the idea of creature typings without necessarily making new creature types. So we see, for example, if I'm just looking at it, I'm using Scryfall just to kind of like look at all these different cards. On the same row that you have Lulu, Loyal Hollyphant, you have another legendary creature called Liazel, Vlaakith's Champion. I'm butchering these names. I'm sorry. Magic has tough enough names. D&D is another level. And they're a legendary creature, Gith Warrior. We don't have Gith in Magic the Gathering, and I will get on to similar examples of how I think they can do these sorts of things later on. But we don't need to have Gith if we can have other creature types that can kind of do more creative and interesting things. And I think the idea of an Elephant Angel to tell the story of Lulu, Loyal Hollyphant, who, in the lore of D&D, Hollyphants are elephant-like creatures from the upper planes. I'm reading off of the Forgotten Realms fandom wiki. And they are themselves celestials. So for all intents and purposes, within the realm of D&D and the Forgotten Realms, they are angels. Now, angels in Magic are actually, when you think about it, very rigidly kept to as an idea. Angels in Magic are the physical manifestation of white mana on the planes that they're involved in, and they are almost exclusively humanoid. They're almost on every plane femme, but we do have mask angels on Amonkhet. And you very rarely, if ever, I'm trying to call to mind, I should have maybe done some more deeper research, I'm trying to call to mind times where we've had angel anything other than Kaldheim, where they did things like Berserker, for example, and that was really exciting. But the actual angels themselves were still presented as humanoid. Why? And this is something that I can say for Magic in general. Magic has a multiverse, an infinite, seemingly, multiverse, where every plane has its own rules to the point of like contradicting other planes and how they work, has its own set of like civilizations, creatures, all this kind of thing. Goblins, for example. Goblins are still goblins on every plane, but they look wildly different from, say, Tarkir to Ixalan to Kylum to Zendikar to Ravnica. Goblins everywhere, they could be individual races in their own right, and yet angels are also always humanoid creatures, and it doesn't make sense to me. Now, I understand, obviously, that if they're concentrations of white mana, they have to be like a certain sort of style, I guess. Like, they're always going to be like slightly angelic. Obviously, they're going to be angelic. But why is it that, say, on Ravnica, we have these humanoid angels, and then on Zendikar, we have humanoid angels? Why couldn't the Zendikari angels have been something completely different, wildly different? They're still angels. They can still have their Zendikari, like, four-winged angelsness, although Ravnica also had four-winged angels. You get the point. I just think that there's some really tight restrictions on where Magic seems to give certain creature types a lot of leeway and other ones not so many. And the idea of having an elephant angel can really capture the imagination. It leads to these interesting discussions of what can these creatures be on different planes. We've just left Capenna, what seems like years ago now already. And the heads of the families were all demons. We had Demon Sphinx, Demon Cat, Demon Vampire, which kind of seemed like almost too close to me, Demon Vampire. I didn't think I spoke about it at the time, but actually is quite different. Yeah. Then we had Demon Bird and I forget, Demon Dragon. Of course, I've built a Zeotora deck, I should know that one. We can do this for demons. Why not angels? Why not in a mainline Magic set we go to another plane? Say we get my Wish and we go to Ir, which is where Turi Island is, if you're a Planes Chase fan, and where the Fomori, the big, giant, lovely goat people like Ruhan live, and say, just for argument's sake, they have horse angels there. Why not? Is a horse angel just a Pegasus? My off-the-cuff hypothesizing is just so basic, but you understand my premise. And it's always interesting when we have these different creature types. Wasatoria? Well, I hope I'm saying that right. From the Dragon Precon, from when we had the Eminence ability, from like 2016, maybe. Cat Dragon. People went nuts, absolutely bonkers for that. So yeah, I think if this set proves anything, is that you don't have to be an unset to have these interesting creature types. Another example, if we're moving away from angels, is Owlbear. And this kind of links back into my point about you not having to have specific creature typings for absolutely every different race in Magic. And I'm not saying they do, but I'm saying we can have interesting ones and still have them represented in a nice way. Owlbear Cub is Bird Bear on its creature typing. That still tracks and reads perfectly for the idea that this is an owlbear. An owlbear is its own thing in D&D, but we didn't need to make creature owlbear. Creature bird bear is absolutely fine. They should be doing more of that. We got a little bit of a taste in Ikoria of this, obviously, but that was almost used as like a marketing ploy. Oh, Ikoria. It really didn't know what it wanted to be. Was it Pokemon? Was it Kaiju? Was it... Who knows? Who knows? Anyway. So I think more of that, please. Let's get some more interesting creature types. Let's get planes with just a bit more diversity. I'm still looking for my Centaur Planeswalker. I don't even need it to be, like, wildly interesting. Where's my Centaur Planeswalker? Like, they gave us just a little titchy taste. They gave us a tiny little taste with, like, having, like, Renin 6 and Renin 7, or... I forget the name of the Planeswalker, the one that's all bugs. They've given us little tastes. Just stop doing humans. Okay. I'll stop talking about broad creature types. I'm now going to move into specific creature types. There are two creature types in Magic which I really wish got a lot more scope in the larger Magic world, and I think have been sold short. And one of them has actually had a lot of representation in Magic, and one of them has had almost none, like percentage-wise, like next to no representation. But both of them have kind of captured my imagination in terms of what they can do, who they are, and that is the Viashino and the Azra, if we're talking in Magic terms. And the reason why I bring them up here is because there are clear analogues from D&D which show just how interesting these creature types could be if they got given a little more legs. For the Viashino, I think the obvious comparison are the dragon folk. Now again, interestingly, they're not referred to as dragon folk as a creature type. All of the dragon folk on the cardboard in Baldur's Gate are known as dragons. So for example, Ambitious Dragonborn is Dragon Barbarian. Or Baal's Invoker, Dragon Shaman, Avenging Hunter, Dragon Ranger, so on and so forth. You get the point. But the kind of agency, is agency the right word? I don't know. The society that's given to the Dragonborn or Dragon folk in Baldur's Gate is just infinitely more interesting than I think anything, and this is maybe a personal taste, anything we've seen of the Viashino in Magic. So if we look at Dragonfolk on 5e, I'm on the D&D wiki for this. The Dragonfolk most likely have their origins shared with other dragons. Most Dragonfolk do not distinguish themselves as people different from dragons as a whole. Some dragon folklore does suggest that dragonfolk descend from dragons who might want to mingle with humanoid races without a disguise, whilst other lore suggests that dragonfolk were dragons whose growth and power was severely stunted, and so they decided to make up for it by creating their own civilization. So these are literal dragon people. Now, if you look at Viashino are also in some MTG lore said to be descended from dragons. So we are literally talking about the same thing here. In classic D&D, in classic MTG fashion, on different planes, Viashino have slightly different bents. So, for example, on, say, Dominaria and Ravnica, the Viashino are far more lizard-like, whereas in Capenna, again, which we've just left, they are actually more dragon-looking. They are more dragony. They've got like longer horns and kind of more classically what we'd think of as fancy dragon, like scaling and snouts and all that kind of thing. So the visual look of them can be kind of malleable, and Capenna is kind of its own thing, I will say, with a lot of the species that we're talking about, and we'll get on to Azra in a minute as well with a similar sort of comparison. Capenna is an outlier because of the society in New Capenna. All the races are at a certain point in like societal development relative to our world. Like they're wearing like overalls, right? And they're building skyscrapers and they're driving cars around. So it's kind of hard to kind of say like, oh, they're a barbaric species or whatever, because they're still technologically more advanced than many other planes relative to our own. Some would argue that doesn't make them more advanced, just makes them more technological, let's say. But for the most part, Viashino are seen as these kind of barbaric, lesser races. Right. Even on something like Ravnica, where you can find Viashino in the Boros Legion, for example, as well as the Izzet League, and you have, is it Viashino? Oh, there's that classic red Viashino card that destroys artifacts. These things, like, they're not like a stupid species by any chance. It's not the same way that like ogres and giants are sometimes portrayed. But they don't seem to have any agency in the story. When was the last time you got a really fleshed out Viashino character? Hell, in the War of the Spark book, there was a Viashino planeswalker that got killed instantly. That's all they're getting. We've got a few legendary Viashino, fine. Not really much to shake about. Whereas in Baldur's Gate, you can see that they're like any other race. This is a point I will say about the races in general, maybe by having all of the races be on like a similar kind of intelligence / agency / social mobility level, maybe that makes things a little bit more homogenized. I will say that that's maybe something that's true, but I think that there could be so much more that could be done, and especially the look of the Dragonborn in Baldur's Gate, I think is very exciting. They look kind of noble. If you look at Scaled Nurturer, the art is by David Galit. Oh, I hope I said that name right. Like, this green dragon druid looks like almost handsome in a way. Like they're quite noble, whereas a lot of the Viashino tend to look quite vicious and acerbic. I just think, again, when I'm talking about creature types and how we can have fun with them, you have this wide open multiverse. How come we haven't gone to a plane which is mostly Viashino as like noble dragonborn that have the predominant force, driving force in the story? Now, I'm guessing that they are just on the wrong side of animal, humanoid, to have, from a kind of like storytelling perspective, maybe relatability. If you think of like something like elves or Fodolkans, or obviously humans, even catfolk, weirdly, I think they're just a little bit more, I don't know, user-friendly. Whereas if you had a whole plane, say if we went to a plane where all of the characters were Sphinx, that might be a nightmare. Narrative-wise. And maybe that's the problem with Viashino. I don't know. I don't think so. But there we are. The other one I wanted to talk about were Azra and their absolute counterpart, Tiefling. Now, I actually have a little bit of a soft spot for Tieflings, because in most of the D&D campaigns that I've played, I gravitate towards Tieflings. I love their whole jam. I love the fact that you get oh my gosh. Thaumaturgy? That's right, isn't it? As like one of your baseline sort of abilities, even though it's a cantrip for other things. I love the idea of warlocks. I think warlocks should be more fleshed out in the idea of magic as a specific type of spellcaster. Obviously, they're trying it as a creature type. But tieflings as sort of humanoid, fiend-blooded characters that are not necessarily, of infernal or abyssal planes, but are kind of descended from them and can kind of interact with the other humanoid races as kind of more equals, as opposed to like these kind of overt forces of evil or deception. I think it's a really interesting idea that you get to essentially play as a demon or a devil without having to sort of ascribe to being kind of like a force of nature, if that makes sense. And we do have in Magic demons and devil characters who are a bit more like down to earth, should we say. So for example, again on Capenna, I mean Capenna's like a really good example actually, talking about it, of how creature types can kind of be changed up. But you do have devil characters in Capenna that are just, part of the everyday hustle and bustle. Whereas, say, on a plane like Innistrad, where you have demons and devils are absolutely the manifestations of evil and torment on the plane, and are not someone you would sit down to have a beer with. Magic is good at having like different planes represent things in different ways, I suppose, in that way. But we don't have this kind of stylized devil fiend character, except for the Azra. The Azra appeared in one set. I mean, they got reprinted in supplemental sets, but they got introduced in Battle Bond. We had one legendary from Battle Bond, Invertus the Veiled. We did get in Jumpstart another one, Kel's Fight Fixer, which was still clearly meant to be in Kylum, the world of Battle Bond. And overall, we have 8 Azra cards. Creature cards, I should say. They do appear on things like spells and enchantments and whatnot. And these are, to look at them, D&D tieflings. They're like purple-skinned, violet-skinned, horned, predominantly humanoid, and just their whole jam just seems to be kind of this slightly like sorcery-based, warlocky, like they all have like glowing weapons and Oh, I tell a lie. Sorry. Azra Smoke Shaper was from Modern Horizons. So there we go. Now, that is an interesting one. I'm going to double back instantly. Azra Smoke Shaper is an interesting one because that's an Azra ninja. And whilst there's nothing to suggest that they're not on Kylum, the style of dress that they are, they would have to sort of say that in the world in Battle Bond, in Kylum, ninjutsu as a practice is a martial art that exists on that planes. And they can say that maybe. Why have we only seen this creature type on that one plane? A plane that had no narrative either. They just got dropped in. It was almost like someone on the world building team was like, I want to do tieflings and magic. And someone said, we can't do tieflings and magic for whatever reason. And so they made the Azra, and this is what we have. I don't necessarily understand it. And I feel like if demons are maybe something we can't necessarily have a whole plane of without them being like the counterpart to angels, for example. So you can't have just a plane of angels that are just, they're the driving force of everything going on. They have to serve a higher function. Like on Kaldheim, there is a realm of angels, but they serve a function in relation to the others. And in Ravnica, whilst angels are part of the hustle and bustle, and demons are too, they are seen as, extreme versions of like their black alignments or their, white alignments. I think there is room to have these sort of meeting in the middles of, slightly lesser demon characters and lesser angel characters. Like you have the Aasimar in Dungeons and Dragons as well, which I don't know if we see many of them in Baldur's Gate. But if you have, the celestial angel type characters, the Aasimar are the more humanoid, more down-to-earth versions of them. My point being is that clearly there's a thirst and a need for these very cool-looking, warlocky demon people. And I really hope we see them again soon. There we go. That's my lot on Azra and Viashino. Second to last point is expansion of world building within a single location. And what I mean by that is that the world of Baldur's Gate is one setting in the Forgotten Realms, which is itself a setting within the wider Dungeons & Dragons universe. But Baldur's Gate and, Waterdeep and, the Sword Coast and all these different little locations are all relatively close to each other and can be, reached and explored within relation to each other very easily. And because of that, and as we see on the cardboard here, you get a broad, wide breadth of ideas of this one singular location that seems very organic and natural and works together very well, but it still feels large, it still feels very broad. And my upset, I think, sometimes with the way that Magic is designing their sets, especially in recent times and recent years, is that they really want to hit home on one very pure and core theme. And that's all they're going to do. And because they're only doing one set blocks, it seems, from here until eternity, they're only going to have one flavour to really grab you with. It's like you're going to an ice cream shop and they're like going, today we're just having mint choc chip. And you're like, yeah, but can't we treat the ice cream shop as a whole? They're like, nope, you're just having mint choc chip. Maybe in a couple of years' time we'll come back and we'll try something else. And I feel that's a real detriment to many of the sets that we're getting. And I'm talking of, say, Eldraine Fords, let's say, because I kind of consider that Eldraine Fords to be is one of the big, End of War of the Spark, Eldraine Fords, that tends to be one of the big sort of signifiers of a new era of Magic design. Because even in the worlds where they do try and expand out larger, it just seems to all be very samey. And I think that was a big problem with Kaldheim. Kaldheim was a really good example of they had 10 realms and the cosmos to deal with. And they still, for each of these realms, only had one thing going on in them. The Dwarf realm, the Human realm, the Demon realm. Istfell. It's just spirits and mist. Alright. And I think in their heads that was enough to, in the world building team, that was enough to kind of be like, look, this is a whole world with many different factors. But, these different realms are all the one thing. It's like the common problem you have in Star Wars. There's a thing that Star Wars gets lampooned a lot, that each planet is just one topographical feature. Hoth is just all snow. Tatooine is just all sand. Forest Moon of Endor, it's a forest moon. Guess what's there? And it didn't always used to be that way. Dominaria, for example, to use as another example, was a varied, huge plane which had different continents, and each continent maybe had its own type of topographical features, but the whole plane itself seemed like a setting that kind of was very broad and wide. Innistrad's another one where they've done a very good job over the sort of 3 sets that we've been there of having the different areas that you have, like Kessig and Hanweir and all these different places, that they feel varied within themselves and as a part of a whole. And you also have the idea of the sea as well. Maybe this thing that's kind of slightly far off and it doesn't get explored maybe as much, but there's enough on the cardboard to suggest that there's this big kind of harbour culture and port culture, and you have these ancient gods that are out in the sea, especially with Runo Stromkirk in the latest set, really hit home this idea that, there be monsters out there, and it's still a functional part of the world. You go to Capenna, Strixhaven, Ravnica to a certain degree, I suppose, but, that's a slightly different problem. But you get told about these larger places. Arcavios, for example, is the plane which Strixhaven is in. Now, I'm not saying that the story would have benefited if we'd left Strixhaven as a school and explored Arcavios wider, but if we ever go back to Arcavios, I bet any amount of money we're going back to Strixhaven and the whole southern continent is not going to be explored. And I think this is a big problem. When we went to Ikoria, we had the 3 main civilizations of Ikoria. You had Dranith, big city. You had Skysail, airships, and Lavabrink in the cliffs next to the sea. But it was still landlocked. Why didn't they take that opportunity? And I've said this before on the podcast, to go out into the sea. What is away from this island? We're only going to get here one shot. So I guess what my point is that although maybe you could argue that Baldur's Gate, because it's a set that is based on an existing IP, that people just want to kind of get a taste of everything and how it's represented on the cardboard, and because it's not a narrative-locked set, that they can afford to be a little bit more broad. But if we're going to get commander sets tied to every single set that's coming out, and not going to get the opportunity to see characters from other sets coming in, or things that are left unseen in the narrative being introduced in other ways, especially, and like, kind of ironic that I'm talking about how D&D Baldur's Gate can inform Magic products, but if they're going to replace a whole Commander Legends set with an IP that's not Magic the Gathering, the biggest selling point of the last Commander Legends set, aside from the fact that it was a draftable Commander format, was the fact that we were going to see characters and settings from all over Magic, like how Commander decks used to be. And the fact that one of my biggest bugbears when I heard about Baldur's Gate being the Commander Legends set was that it was not going to be a Magic IP, so that whole opportunity was taken away. Anyway, what I'm saying is, if they're not going to have these opportunities to feed in all this extra stuff, they need to broaden it out slightly. Not every time. There's always variety to be had. But if you're going to talk about the outer city limits in Capenna, give us a couple of cards. Give us a taste of what does that mean. I mentioned Ravnica earlier. Ravnica has a slight problem where they do show us things like the Rubble Belt, and they do show us different parts of Ravnica as a whole, and they definitely do a good job of making each guild have an area of the city that is very much their own. Their problem narratively is that everything takes place in the 10th district. There's one district in the entirety of Ravnica, and apparently every major event on the plane happens there. But, that's a slightly different issue. But yes, I guess looking at the set as a whole, Baldur's Gate feels very large, as well it might. It has a lot of lore behind it. And I think the world-building team does such a great job of building these worlds, these planes, that when it gets condensed down into 350, 400 cards, so much of that is lost. And there needs to be a redressing of the balance, I think. Alright, last one. Space! Dungeons & Dragons does space. I mean, not really, but it does. And it's definitely something that Magic needs to take on board. By what I mean by space is that, and I mentioned this earlier, depending on what cosmology you use, whether it's the, what's it called? The Great Wheel cosmology, the World Tree cosmology, or the World Axis, there is the astral plane and realm space, or the astral sea as it's sometimes called. I know they're different. This is where my sort of brain for Dungeons & Dragons lore just kind of stopped, because the amount of, if I look at, say, for example, the wheel cosmology, right? The Great Wheel. Just the map of that just makes my brain bleed a little bit. Because you have the material plane, and then Feywild and Shadowfell around the material plane, then you have the ethereal plane that surrounds that, then the elements, then the elemental chaos, then the inner planes, and then the astral plane, and the stuff. There's just a lot going on, but they treat all the different planes as almost, I'm going to get shouted at, they treat them like celestial bodies, essentially, which is something that the direct analogue in Magic the Gathering of the Blind Eternities and the planes themselves. There's a real issue that Magic has narratively of how it treats celestial bodies and the idea of space. So in Magic, there was an old idea that was Dominaria was the center of the multiverse. It was a physical core that all the other planes moved around, and that if something happened on Dominaria, it would ripple out and affect other planes. And planes were physically able to interact with each other as well. For example, the plane of Wrath overlaid onto Dominaria in one of the big invasion storylines during the Phyrexian invasion. That was something where two planes crashed into each other, right? So planes are physical entities in an old way of thinking. They slightly moved away from that idea, I think, where Dominaria isn't necessarily the bright center of the multiverse. But it's still not. The idea is that these planes don't necessarily have like an atmosphere which can be broken through to reach bodies within the world of that plane, like how we would leave Earth and go to the moon, or indeed any other celestial body that's within our remit to do so. Whereas in D&D, that is exactly how that works. But when they leave the plane and go through the astral sea, they're breaking through these different barriers and these different atmospheres, if you like, to go to other places. And the card that set me up for this, and it blew my mind when I saw it, because just to see this card as a magic card and to have the kind of thematic sort of signifiers on it, I just hadn't seen that on a magic card before. And it was Nautiloid Ship. I'm not going to bother reading what it does. The Nautiloid Ship, whether you're looking at the Daniel Lundgren art or the Peter Dura art, which is the borderless one. I think the Daniel Lundgren one's maybe more close to this. But Nautiloid Ship, in the world of D&D, the Nautiloid ships are the Mind Flayer's vessels, and they're these big conical shells that have tentacles coming out the front of them, and they are their sort of flying vessels. And these vessels, whilst in, say, Dungeons & Dragons campaign settings, can be these flying machines. In the world of Spelljammer, which I only learned existed because of this card, Spelljammer is a campaign setting predominantly in the Astral Sea, with these ships known as Spelljammers, and I think there is actually a ship called the Spelljammer, which is where they get the name from. These ships serving as vessels, and it's pirates in space, because it's all very nautical based. It's not like sci-fi, it's not like Star Trek, it's more like, I don't know, Treasure Planet, I guess? But I love it. Anyway, this idea that you can kind of exist in the blind eternity, in the astral plane, and kind of surf around in these ships and kind of have like space adventures, but fantasy, science fantasy rather than science fiction. And there is a distinction there. Say a kind of, I suppose, a really kind of quick distinction would be Star Trek is hard science fiction, whereas Star Wars is more space opera / science fantasy. Obviously, mileages may vary, and different interpretations of Star Wars, especially, might be more science fiction than science fantasy. But that's like they're using space swords versus like hard science space stuff. That's the kind of distinction there. And because magic has this real problem with how it treats its celestial bodies, like this is something I've always struggled with, and I'm sure someone can tell me better. But this is something that I know I've struggled with, and if you look at it for even a second, I know other players struggle with. Amonkhet has a whole thing revolving around its suns, Innistrad's moon, the null moon on Dominaria, versus, say, something like Nyx. They got around it with Nyx in Theros, because they cleverly had this idea of having stargazing and their kind of celestial bodies being the literal realm of the gods. So they kind of play around with it, the idea of realms being a thing. In Kaldheim, for example, we also had the literal cosmos that moved through, much more in a D&D sense. You could move through the cosmos on vessels to get to other realms of existence. In fact, Kaldheim is very in D&D in that respect. But magic has never really nailed down on how these celestial bodies function in a way where they're kind of plane-locked, but also still up in the sort of ether of these different planes. And I think they just need to overhaul it slightly. I genuinely do. The idea of the Blind Eternities is a really nice narrative idea. And maybe this is something that would be ruined if they played around with it too much. But it's a really nice narrative idea to keep the planes separated and only being able to be travelled by incredibly powerful beings, i.e. planeswalkers, or, say, the Weatherlight when it had plane hopping abilities. So you could kind of have these separated worlds still living within one large narrative, but without necessarily informing each other too much. And then you could have these big story beats where you have like the Phyrexian invasion and using portal technology and all that kind of stuff. That kind of makes it kind of adds that danger element of, oh, this thing is a big deal because it's unusual. Whereas in D&D, although the Spelljammers are maybe rarer, and as a campaign setting, you does sort of fudge some of the rules slightly, I definitely feel like it just opens up a whole world where you can have fun and do interesting things. And just the aesthetic as well of having this kind of naval spacefaring adventure. I think it's just absolutely fantastic, and it's something that Magic just needs to sort out. I think a little bit. Maybe it would break the tension of the multiverse, and this is one of the things where at the top of the show I was saying maybe simpler is better, maybe less is more with Magic, the way Magic is set up. But I think they've avoided talking about it for so long now, and it's clearly an itch that the world-building team wants to scratch. Again, as I said, we've seen similar things in Theros, although obviously Theros as original set was quite a while ago now, but you have the Cosmos in Kaldheim, for example. It's clearly something they want to do. Warhammer 40k is coming into Magic as Commander decks. Obviously that's science. I guess it's grimdark, but it's set in a futuristic space setting. Unfinity as an unset is all like is it atom punk? I forget the actual terminology for the actual style of it is, but it's all it's space set. So it's clearly something that the Magic team want to explore a little bit more, and I think it's one of these little rules that Magic has had for a while of like, we don't really do space. And it was certainly one of the things that was said to me very early on in my Magic career when I said, oh, do they do space cards? Someone said to me, Magic doesn't really do space, it's something you want to avoid. I think now's the time. Now's the time that we can see, just on this one card, Nautiloid ship, which has inspired me so much, just to see a fantasy entity in space. I think Magic should do it. I think there should be maybe one plane. Maybe it could be a plane, or the plane itself is an asteroid field. Because if they're not tied to physical, if the plane itself still exists, it doesn't need to physically be like a land. I don't know. Could be interesting. That, I think, is my lot for the different lessons that we can take from D&D as we see it on Magic cards. There are obviously larger things that we could sort of, like, if we were to look at D&D in a kind of larger setting and a larger sense, I'm sure there's many things that we could like look at and take from it to kind of help Magic along, maybe in its narrative choices. But I'm going to circle back around to what I said at the start of the show. I think Magic does a really good job at telling the story that it's meant to be telling. There's just certain things that I feel like maybe just need a revamp and a lick of paint that this set could help with. And maybe it's a signifier that that's exactly what they'll be doing. I don't know. I'm going to do one last little shout out to what I think is the art of the set, and that is Cloak of the Bat by Dominic Mayer. Holy shit. I mean, I like cloaks in Magic, just in general. Like Whisper Silk Cloak, both artworks. It's a pet card for me, mechanically, but both artworks are fantastic. Cloak and Dagger is another cloak. Haunted Cloak. Cloaks in Magic are pretty cool. So to get Cloak of the Bat is pretty amazing. And yeah, this artwork just has so much movement. It's just the silhouette of the person wearing the cloak with the daggers. It's just abstract enough. And it's an equipment. Like, you don't usually see abstract or like, suppose, non-fantasy realistic renderings of equipment cards for some reason. I don't know why, but this is absolutely perfect. There is also an alternate art in the classic D&D like sourcebook style by Diesel. Again, equally good art. Well, not equally good. It's not to my personal taste, but it's a very good representation of a cloak, which I kind of like. I just wish I had a cloak, guys. I just wish I could wear a cloak every day. I mean, I can. Maybe I will. But yeah, that's your lot from me talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Wish Nathan well. He's in Mexico still. He will be back for Command Fest Birmingham, which is happening on the 9th and 10th of July. I will also be there on the 10th, which is the Sunday. So Nathan's going to be there for both days. I'm going to be there on the 10th. Looking forward to seeing a bunch of my Magic friends and Nathan's Magic friends that we've gotten to know over the course of this podcast. Very excited to see some people face to face and actually sling spells over something that's not a camera. And actually real life, real world stuff going on. Also just excited to play Magic again. I kind of sort of said at the top of the show, life has been hard recently. And I know I'm not the only one that's going through hard things at the moment. And sometimes you just kind of, you get wrapped up. And I think this is true of people's lives in general, not just related to Magic, but this is a Magic podcast and I am a guy who plays Magic. You get wrapped up in some of the not so nice stuff in life, And because it needs your attention, and because you need to focus on the hardships that you're personally going through, and acknowledging that you are going through hardships as well, and not burying your head in the sand. Obviously, the things that give you joy, that require attention, and magic requires a lot of attention, get put to the side a little bit. But you just have to remind yourself, you just have to really remember that you have this thing that brings you joy. And it's okay to have that thing give you some joy, even in the darkest of times. And I must admit, it took me a couple of days longer than it should have done to remember that I had this microphone. And I have a box of magic cards set behind me. And there's yet another new set that's just come out. And I hadn't spoken about it yet. So there you are. Cool. Let me know what your favourite cards are from Baldur's Gate, and what other things from D&D, maybe on the cardboard, but also in general, could teach magic a thing or two. What could magic teach D&D? Ooh, do I really want to poke the D&D bear and go at it from that angle? Really attack Dungeons & Dragons nerds? I'm not going to do that. Let us know on our Twitter at mtflavouring. Emails go to mtflavouring@gmail.com. My personal Twitter is at AndyManface. Nathan's is at the Fox and the Moon. Look after yourself, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Magic the Flavouring.